This is Terry of Vorshlag. We're going to do a quick video showing some things we learned from the S550 Mustang chassis after they've been crashed. So we've seen the S197 chassis crash before, and we kind of know where those tend to move and get tweaked when they hit another car. But the S550 chassis is new enough to we haven't seen a lot of these that had a wheel-to-wheel contact. This car did. Another car spun in front of it and hit it right in this corner from a kind of an oblique angle, and it broke a number of things, and we're going to talk about what that did, how the repairs were done, and where these chassis tend to move around. Alright, you can see the body is all cleaned up, and our friend Shiloh at Heritage Collision in Sherman, Texas got all that taken care of. It needed a new front bumper cover, and there's still one piece here that needs to be added. They get a little floppy here, and I'll show you on the other side. It's fairly common for these to come loose from the fender, the bumper cover, which is a plastic, ABS plastic piece. And this has got a quick latch that the owner had done, and that's fairly common. You hit a cone in an autocross or barely even touch this thing and it breaks these tabs. So that's fairly common fix. So he'll add that to the other side, and that's a quick latch. You push it in the center and it pops it loose, but it gives it a better attachment than the factory plastic clips. It's a little plastic bracket and it kind of pops in. You look at it funny, it breaks those clips. So on the initial impact, a number of things happened. The front bumper corner was torn, the headlight was broken, the fender was shredded, and I'll show a picture of that. It pretty much just tore it off. This is aluminum, as is the hood. Luckily the hood wasn't damaged. Like I said, this is plastic. The wheel took a pretty good hit and it broke the wheel. It also deformed quite a bit and soaked up a lot of damage, but it was literally a wheel hit there at a pretty high rate of speed. Inside the suspension, a number of things broke. This front suspension has two control arms. It has a lateral link and what they call a TC, or tension control rod. This is they call it a double ball jointed front suspension. It has some geometry advantages. This is pretty common for German cars. BMWs have used these for years. And these two bolt onto the front spindle. Well, as you can see, the impact was pretty hard lateral hit, and it broke this cast or forged steel. It's hard to tell. It broke this arm, and apparently that's fairly common. And you can see it bent this tie rod in, this ball joint in, pretty severely. We noticed that, replaced it, had a fender and a door that we got from one of my other cars, a 2015 we're building, that's getting all carbon stuff. Put a spare wheel on. This is a wheel I had a spare that I bent driving over a curb at 130. So it works fine. It's just got a high-speed vibration. But the curb I went over was pretty massive. But it let us drive the car onto the trailer and get it to the body shop. When we got it back from the body shop, and I'll show a picture, this wheel was further back in the fender opening because we didn't have the fender mounted. It was hard to see that. And we had looked at this TC rod, and this is the one that came out of it. It had a spherical on one end, and it's straight, and we could not figure out why there was an offset in the wheel. So we installed some SPL control arms, and they're adjustable in length, so you can get more camber and more caster adjustment, and we needed to pull the wheel forward and in to fix what we saw as a wheelbase issue side to side. What it turned out to be, when we went to put the SPL arms on, this nut right here was covering up a very elongated hole, and I'll show the side-by-side pictures. This new spindle is like under $250 from Ford, and this it was an easy repair there. The strut took a pretty big hit because it took an impact on the wheel, and it bent this, which was somewhat extended as he was trying to steer away from the incident. And that's fairly a normal kind of failure on a pretty hard impact like this. So we replaced the strut. And another thing we saw that was kind of unusual was the 2-pound aluminum transmission crossmember shattered. And what we think happened there was the engine and transmission weighs about 650 pounds. We've weighed that before, a Coyote and the 6-speed. And we think as the car got hit from the side, the drivetrain kind of acted like a mass damper of its own, and it moved relative to the car on the hydraulic motor mounts and transmission bushing, which is really soft and squishy. And we think that shock load shattered this 2-pound casting. And it was a little freaky, but that was replaced. It was still holding in there. The motor mounts held the drivetrain in the car, as did the drive shaft. but everything else looked good in the tunnel. So that was all squared away before we took it to the body shop. When we got it back to the body shop, we knew his front seat bracket was bent pretty badly. Now this is heavily modified and it has some Home Depot repairs done to it because it just didn't fit the car very well. And these little bitty brackets like this tend to not crash very well. So the seat bracket we make for the S550 is a pretty healthy piece. We cut this out on the CNC plasma table and we add these ribs, and it's pretty stout. And this design has been crashed by another customer in a different car that uses the same style. So we've gone to this style mount, and it's a little bit heavier than these little plate, weldments like this, but it's a heck of a lot stronger and they crash better. But when we went to go put this in his car, the bolt holes didn't line up in the seat bracket, and they weren't even close. And I'll show pictures here. There was a lot of deformation in the tub, so when his seat, let's imagine a 200 or 300 pound person here, and the car moves and there's a big deflection and it came forward and it pulled the seat pan up as the car reacted, as the body reacted to the crash. It permanently deformed the floor pan. And so that repair was done, and we'll get the car in the air and show that. It was about 15 minutes of hammering with a 2x4 and a sledgehammer, and we got that all squared away. So that was a little strange to see that, but apparently according to our body guy, he's like, nope, that's totally normal. These floor pans are really soft and they move around a lot. So on these cars, according to a guy I know in the insurance industry that sees these crash a lot, and according to Shiloh at our body shop, they have, two different load paths. There's this upper frame horn, they call it the shotgun or upper horns, and then there's the lower frame horn itself. The lower frame horn had a tiny little bend in it, and he pulled that, and then this is almost always bent in a crash. And that's what was unusual about the 2015 we bought. These were actually pretty straight. And they deform in a couple of areas, and they need to soak up energy, but they don't want that to move too much because it starts transferring load into the chassis if it's too stiff. So that was pulled back. The lower frame rail is pulled back. It's got a really extensive front subframe. It's this big H-looking frame, the lower front subframe, and that's where all the suspension and the engine mounts to that, and the steering rack, and even the radiator mounts. That was actually in pretty good shape. The flanges where these two control arms mount had a little tweak to them, and yeah, a perfect repair would have replaced that, but it's almost $1,000 part. You got to hang the engine and pull the whole thing out, and that's a bunch of labor. The customer may do that down the road, but we'll get the alignment back in. With the SPL arms, we can get the alignment squared away, and it saves a bunch of time and money, and he can make his race event. We got this car, was wrecked 3.5 weeks ago, and it'll be on track tomorrow in less than 4 weeks. So we're really happy with that. Shiloh did a great job. Our guys here did a really good job getting things squared away. Well, once we hammered the floor pan flat again, we got the seat back in, and I'm really happy with the repairs. So inside the car, there's a number of airbags that go off. There's some up here in the roof. Obviously the steering wheel, we cut those out. The car is becoming more of a race car. Repairing those would have really jacked the cost up, and we kept the cost a very reasonable amount so that an insurance claim didn't have to be made. And this car really is pretty much track only now. He's got real harnesses, a real seat, and a Hans, so there's really no need for these airbags. It's not street driven anymore. Yeah, the car had a secondary hit back here, and Shiloh was able to fix this fender, even fixed a hole that was torn into this bumper cover, and that saved a good chunk of money, so I'm glad he was able to do that. So this is the front subframe. It's a pretty extensive unit. It goes all the way back and all the way forward to the lower radiator mount. It has two cross members, one where the suspension loads really go through, and that also holds the engine and the steering rack, and the other one that's just there at the very front of the frame horns. Again, it looks good. It measures out right, but there's a slight tweak at these two control arm mounts. Ideally, that would have been replaced, but it was just a time and cost thing. So like I said before, the transmission crossmember shattered when the drivetrain did its little wiggle. It wasn't very expensive, and it's relatively easy to replace. The exhaust system had gotten knocked around. This is an aftermarket exhaust with long tube headers. And there's a lot of slip joints, and those get moved around. It had a lot of exhaust leaks. We fixed all that. That was fairly straightforward. But the funny thing happened back here. So this is the rear floor pan, and it's looked different from this side, and he only had a, obviously the driver didn't have a passenger in there, and this really deformed and pulled up and creased as the seat moved during the impact or after the impact. And that just took some hammering to get back into place, and I'll show that. It was pretty far out of whack, but after Brad hammered that back into place, the seat bracket bolted right in. So I thought that was unusual until we looked at our black 2015 that had also been in a slightly different but a front impact, and it had the same deformation on the passenger side from a heavy person or whatever reacting to forces under the crash, and it torqued the floor pan. So that was kind of a wacky thing we found at the last minute, but luckily the frame rails, the rocker seams, everything was straight. It's a really rigid chassis. There's a lot of mass in the frame, and especially in this cross member on the back seat, in the C pillars, the A pillars, the firewall. There's a lot of rigidity inside the core of the car, whereas the very front frame rails are fairly soft or made to move. They didn't take a front hit per se, so they didn't get moved. They normally do, and I'll show what they look like on our 2015 that took a front impact. But yeah, look for that. Luckily nothing bad happened back here. The subframe is pretty stout back here, but we've seen some rear impacts where they fold up an accordion on the rear frame rails as well. Let's start over. This is our 2015 Rolly chassis we bought for $2,500. It was a performance pack, GT 5-liter automatic. We bought it rather cheaply. Obviously it has some front end damage, and I'll point out some of the aspects of different types of damage this car had that the white car did not. As I was told, these upper shotguns were nearly perfect, and they are, but when I took it to Shiloh to have him check some measurements, he did see a little teeny deformation here and here. He says it wasn't enough to be worth pulling. He also saw a slight tweak there, but it looks fairly straight along that frame rail, and he said it all checks out. When he did his tram gauge measurements, which is diagonal measurements, it all checked out as square. This front subframe will probably replace. It's like I said, it's about an $800 to $1,000 a piece. We've got everything out of the way, and we can replace it with these 8 fasteners here and have a perfectly square subframe. That's probably smart if we're going to be building LS swap kits around this. So we'll get one of those coming. It has taken a hit down here at this radiator support mount, and something bonked into it there. Obviously the frame rail is bent on this side. Just the flange has been here. We can square this back up. The frame rail's perfectly square. This one took a hit, and when it hit something, maybe even a pole, and it bent the main bumper beam and this lower piece here. Now we can cut this off because this doesn't matter, but the class we're building for, we want to make sure we're squeaky clean, so we'll replace this part of the frame rail right here. This is about 8 or 9 inches, so we've got a piece coming in. But otherwise the tub is really straight, and I was really happy with this purchase. It actually came out better than I'd hoped. There's a lot of metal inside this chassis. There's a lot of meat. There are many layers deep down in here for this kind of back seat cross member. It's pretty stout. There's some back seat structure in the upper shelf and in the roof area, and in along the roof perimeter. We may cut a lot of that out to get some weight out of this car. We're shooting for a pretty aggressively low weight. But overall, this car was a slightly different hit than the white car, which was really hit from the side, and it had some structural damage in here that this car didn't have. So both S550 Mustangs we show have slightly different damage, but they did have one thing in common: with the floor pan moved from the weight of a passenger in the collision. The floor pan sheet metal itself is fairly soft. That's easy to massage back. But as long as the frame rails are fairly straight, other than out of the extremities where we can replace them, that's really what matters. You can get a car cross-checked by a body shop or someone with a laser alignment table, and make sure your chassis is square before you put a cage in it, before you build anything off the front suspension pickup points. You want to make sure that's all squared up. So yeah, that's something to check whenever you're building a car or repairing some crash damage. Thanks for checking out our video. Don't forget, we have hundreds of videos on our YouTube page that cover all sorts of cars, not just Mustang chassis, like this S197 or the S550 we showed you today. Thanks again.